Hey, welcome back, guys. Thanks for having me again. I'm Ava Sullivan, not doctor yet, but I appreciate the accolade. I'm going to be speaking to methods for behavioral risk investigation, and I'm going to be growing the conversation from where I left off yesterday. So what I'm going to speak to are what methods we can use to understand human behavioral risk for emerging infectious diseases, what data should be collected to link exposure to outcome, and what the strengths and weaknesses of, or opportunities, I should say, for the qualitative, quantitative, and observational methods that I describe. And this is a big topic, so it's really an introduction. I would encourage any of you, if you are interested in using any of these tools in your research or your practice, to come talk more about it, because I'm really going for breadth here, but all of these topics, there's so much to it, and really these investigative tools, many of their strengths are in their richness and in their ability to go deep. So I'm presenting them broadly today, but if you're interested in any of them, I'd love to talk about them further. So this is where we left off yesterday. The goals of a behavioral risk characterization starts with the identification and monitoring of behaviors, attitudes, practices, and social and cultural norms, and conditions that facilitate animal-human and animal-animal contact and influence the spillover, amplification, and spread of pathogens. The second level is sort of to take that identification and monitoring and combine it with other data that we collect. So the biological and ecological surveillance that we're also doing to identify risk factors by linking exposure to outcome within the specific context. And that's really where it gets fun. That's where it gets sort of most collaborative in nature, and the data gets more and more powerful as you combine it with these concurrent sampling efforts. And then the third element is taking this data and targeting high-risk contact behaviors for further in-depth studies or to advise on intervention or policy, depending on your results and where you can make most impact. I think with a behavioral risk investigation, the most important thing is to start with your study design and your study objectives. So it's important to go back and think really what you want to achieve, particularly with some of these qualitative methods. It's so, going into a community and observing and doing ethnographies, it's such a big endeavor to understand culture. So really pairing your study goals is important to everything you do. So I just, in this particular context of SaberNet, the overall objective is to detect phyllo, Henipa, and zoonotic coronaviruses in bat populations in southern Africa, and evidence of spillover in humans and livestock. But that specific objective for the behavioral risk characterization is assessing human behavioral risk for exposure to these agents at select bat-human-animal interfaces. So that's really our North Star. That's where all of these in-depth investigations will start. I need to talk to Kendra after this talk because she had a much further fleshed out Venn diagram of the One Health disciplines that are involved. Many more disciplines were listed, and I liked it better. So, but when we're working with these qualitative and quantitative methods of behavioral risk investigation, I think at least for my practice, we're coming mostly from this light green human circle and working with tools from the social sciences and humanities as well as human medicine. But the power really comes when you combine it with the other data that's been collected. So this is not a siloed effort. Really, the strength lies in being able to work in that middle space there. I'm going to talk broadly about two different approaches a qualitative research approach and a quantitative research approach. I think many of us are pretty familiar with a quantitative research approach. So this is an overly simplified look at some of the differences between qualitative and quantitative research, but it's useful comparison because it highlights the strengths inherent in both approaches. A sort of adage is that the quantitative approach is 3 questions for 1,000 respondents. The qualitative approach is 1,000 questions for 3 respondents. So when we do quantitative research, the goal is really to quantify data and generalize results taken from a sample of a population of interest and measure incidence of a specific occurrence or chosen sample, in a chosen sample, excuse me. The sample's typically larger, and depending on the study design, randomly selective and meant to be representative of the population of interest. So that's a really big difference. And the analysis is a statistical one. So you collect data that is quantitative in nature, and then you can analyze it through statistical analyses. Now, qualitative research, really the goal is to understand context, to understand the how and the whys. It is able to uncover patterns and to provide insights into the setting of a problem. It's usually, in terms of samples, smaller and non-representative. So a quantitative survey number can be 1, it can be 3. It's not meant to be representative, it's meant to provide context. And the analysis is non-statistical, although there is rigor and systems involved. It's non-statistical and it's not usually expressed using numbers. So for qualitative, the point is really to understand the reasons, the motivations, the hows. The qualitative, I tend to think that it's really good at creating a hypothesis or understanding a certain phenomenon that is deeply uncharacterized. So I'll go into that a little bit more. So why do we do qualitative research? I think sometimes when people are first exposed to qualitative research as quantitative researchers, it's sort of shocking. It feels like it goes against some of these things that are ingrained in us when we do quantitative research, where it's like the bigger the better and the more statistical power the better. But there are real reasons to choose this type of study design, especially when understanding rare phenomenon like spillover and understanding something that is underrepresented in the literature. So qualitative research allows us to collect rich and detailed information on how individuals experience and understand aspects of their lives. This makes it a really powerful tool when we're thinking about risk. It allows us to better identify and explore new ideas. It allows us to explore social worlds that are rapidly changing. So we know there's lots of change involved, particularly in the last presentation about ecology. Rapidly changing, complex, diverse, and fluid. So I find that qualitative research can really help our understanding of complex systems, which we know from the theoretical models of spillover that these topics are certainly that. Not all human experience can be best understood through quantification. So if we're talking about human experiences with livestock, with wildlife, or with something like cultural norms, qualitative research can really get at the heart of what you're trying to measure. And interviews can also be an iterative process, which is tailored to knowledge and experience of the respondents. So you can have more flexible tools as you're moving from, say, individual to individual or community to community. I am going to talk about a few specific methodologies within this qualitative approach that allow us to look at different levels of the community. I am going to describe observational research, which tends to get at the broadest human environment level, or a community, let's say environment level. Focus groups, which tend to address sort of a mid-level or community level, and then ethnographic interviews, which is really about an individual. So I'm going to go through methods related to each of those. So observational research is a method where targets are observed and analyzed in natural or real world environments. And it's a good approach when the goal is to evaluate ongoing behavior processes or events or situations, or when the physical outcomes are readily seen. So a good example of this is a really great paper that I put here at the bottom on market characteristics and zoonotic disease risk perception in Cameroon bushmeat markets. Now, the results or characteristics of these bushmeat markets can be physically seen. And sometimes when we're doing something like an interview, it's actually hard to get people to talk about a sensitive topic like bushmeat markets. But you can go and you can do some systematic observational methods to understand phenomena that are occurring there. I also think that this is a particularly opportune point to maximize your ecological data collection or site characterization that usually gets paired with something like bat sampling efforts or livestock sampling efforts. So if you're going to a bat population and making sort of field notes, you can actually formalize those in terms of observational research, and it can be presented as results and give context to the work that you're doing, say biosampling or something like this. Excuse me. These are a few more examples of qualitative approaches, of observational research. So observational research, really, it's about observing in real life. And these can take a number of different forms, in the form of field notes, mapping, checklists, a walk along, or even visual methods like photography. All of these observational research methods can come on a spectrum between direct observation, so as a researcher you're observing, or you can do it from the point of view of a participant. So if you take a community member along and ask them to walk you through a market, for example, this becomes a way to understand a bushmeat market that you might not be able to do just as a researcher entering into the situation. A similar spectrum exists for use of photography. Autophotography is the process of a researcher taking photos to understand a situation better. Photo elucidation is the process of a researcher showing a participant a photo and asking them to respond to it. So there are different ways to directly or participatorily engage in observational research. This is a paper from Predict and EcoHealth Alliance team in Indonesia that used observational research data in their characterization of a wildlife trade in Indonesia. They used photography, but they also used a sort of spatial mapping and describing the markets that they were observing. The next qualitative approach is a focus group. So this is the community level. These are sort of like an aggregated interview. Many people are familiar with focus groups if you think about market research. So focus groups are really good to have carefully planned and guided discussions to capture collective and community views, capture ideas that people agree on in public. So that's a very important piece of the puzzle here, is this tends not to be the best approach if you're talking about extremely sensitive data or sensitive topics with a diverse group of people, because a lot of bias enters the equation. But it can be used to gain consensus among specific groups like experts. So I put an example here of a paper that did a focus group where they had zoonotic disease experts come in and speak together in a focus group to gain consensus on prioritization of zoonotic diseases. So focus groups can be a place where you actually systematically build consensus and then are able to present the results of that. You can also use a focus group to target single demographics with shared voices. So understand what a group feels about a specific topic. A focus group can be a really exciting method to employ at the beginning of your study when you're trying to identify gatekeepers or stakeholders to the communities that you're working in. So getting a group of people together from a community and asking who actually plays a role in handling bats in this community, who interacts with bats, who are the leaders, who are the people that would play a role in this topic that I'm interested in. The next qualitative approach that I'm going to describe is the ethnographic interview. This is really something that functions on the individual level. The ethnographic interview is most powerful to understand or to know what someone thinks, to know their views, to hear a story, to compare accounts, and to understand complexity. Because really, when you're able to speak with someone one-on-one, that complexity is not flattened by consensus or anything other than that single person story. So this is a really good way to identify individuals of power, to capture complexity and unforeseen data, and is really one of the best tools to identify the unknowns. So I tend to think that in thinking about high-risk interfaces, an interview can really be a strong way to gain that first entry point to the highest risk interfaces with wildlife. I like this quote. I think it describes really what interviews do. As the objectives of interviews is a fine textured understanding of beliefs, attitudes, values, and motivations in relation to behaviors of people in particular social contexts. So for me, when I hear that quote, I think that's really what we're trying to understand with behavioral risk before we link it, at least, to exposure. Still thinking about interviews, there's a lot of different ways that you can perform an interview. Again, it's on a spectrum between informal to structured. I tend to advocate in these cases to a semi-structured methodology because it allows for space for the conversation and complexity to grow, but it also allows for multiple interviews to be collected and have consistency across the interviews. So making sure that if there are specific topics that you want to cover, those topics get addressed, but also there's real space for people to elucidate the truths of their individual lives. Here's a great study that uses ethnographic interviews. Forgive me, I missed a key definition that I just want to go back for a second and describe. I'm saying the word ethnography or ethnographic. And ethnography is a form of field research that seeks to learn the culture of a particular setting or environment. And it relies on participant observation through fieldwork. And may include qualitative and quantitative methods. I just wanted to make sure I elucidated that word for you guys. So this is a great study that uses ethnographic interviews. Their methods were that residents in rural communities in southern China were recruited and enrolled. They collected ethnographic interviews and paired it with field observations, and then thematically coded and analyzed the results to identify risk factors and protective factors for zoonotic disease emergence. And the methods that they used, just as I've been walking you through, were able to elucidate individual, community, and policy level recommendations for intervention points. So that's really, I think, just quite a strong application of these qualitative methods. And what this paper found was that there's frequent human-animal interactions and low levels of biosecurity and biosafety in the communities that these interviews took place. And they were able to collate a couple of really practical recommendations out of it and plan for future studies. So I think this is really a great example of what ethnographic interviews can do. going to zoom through some of these just because I'm looking at our time, but this is an example of an interview guide and a probing guide for a semi-structured interview. So really the idea is to make sure that you have your salient themes that you want to hit, but you also have probes to make sure that the conversation becomes rich, complex, and that the participant is comfortable speaking to all the areas that you want to cover. This is an example of a coding tree for the results of a qualitative ethnographic interview. I wanted to share this because I think sometimes maybe a misconception is that there's not systematic, rigorous ways to do analysis on qualitative methods, but nothing could be further from the case. This process of coding an interview is really where these themes emerge and how you develop your results as a qualitative analyst. So the raw interview becomes transcribed, is often recorded with something as simple as a field recorder. You could use your phone. You transcribe the interview, and of course there are ways to do that with software, but I actually find the act of transcribing the interview, listening to it and typing it is where I first start thinking about codes that are emerging. You can then use some really great software to help keep track and manage your codes. The two that I recommend and use are NVivo and MaxQDA. Unfortunately, they are not free software. You can do all this coding on an Excel sheet with a highlighter. Some of my really old school professors, that's how they were raised to do this, and it's entirely possible. This software makes it easier to connect with analysis packages like R or just maintain your data, but it can be as low cost as a Google Sheet. So as these codes are organized, this is sort of the analysis flow that you would use. And it's an iterative process where the results emerge as you code theme and sub-theme. This is an example of the coding tree, or the coding themes, I should say, from that paper that I shared. These are the codes that emerged as the data was coded. So as the interviews were being transcribed, this is what the researcher wanted to track, is mention of animal taxa, animal contact, illness, treatment, and death, demographics, and biosecurity. And then the code segments, the analysis was placing these codes within risk factors and protective factors. So this was a really great, rigorous coding tree that came out of that research. Okay, we're going to move on to quantitative data collection, and really this is the best, I should say the most common quantitative data collection tool that we use in behavioral risk is the survey. So this is used to quantify and measure phenomenon through questionnaires and then subsequent statistical processing. It often includes a process of interviewing or face-to-face surveying and then this tree is just a very parsed down process of what the survey process entails. So again, we're starting with the research objectives, choosing a mode and a sampling frame. We move down to validate and test our survey, to recruit the sample, and then the rest is cleaning and analysis. I'm going to talk briefly about a specific type of survey that we use frequently in behavioral risk studies called a CAP survey. CAP is an acronym for Knowledge, Attitudes, and Practices. This CAP model seeks to ask questions about knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. Knowledge questions are, what do people know about zoonotic disease transmission, One Health, conservation, zoonotic diseases, whatever your study question is. Attitude questions relate to what do people think or feel about, fill in the blank based on your study question, and behavioral practice questions are about what people do. So a CAP survey is really good at studying the extent of a known situation. So that's different from the qualitative methods that we spoke about previously, right? Qualitative methods can really reveal something that is unknown. A survey can only measure something that that is known, something that you're asking about. A CAP survey can enhance the knowledge, attitudes, and practices around specific themes. It can establish a baseline for future assessments, and it's also good, similar to qualitative methods, it can suggest intervention points. But it doesn't reveal new problems or deepen the understanding of a situation. It can only go in a flat line because, again, you're developing these questions where it's something that you already know. You're asking questions about a situation that you're already aware of. This is a more fleshed out version of the process of developing, drafting, implementing, and analyzing a CAP survey. I put some of the key processes in red. This is a modified version of a checklist that I used myself. I think that a lot of this work really stems from the survey protocol. I think that maybe most disciplines have this adage, junk in, junk out. A badly designed survey is really hard to analyze, and even if you're able to analyze it rigorously, it means very little. So developing the protocol and the survey itself is just absolutely important, and it all starts with relating everything to your study question. The implementation is also important. This is the field work. This is where you're actually bringing it to communities. And then data analysis. I think in terms of time, I'm not going to go into individual pieces of this, but I love survey design. It's a very exciting part of the process. So if anyone has questions, they can ask. Major themes for the PREDICT survey, which is really a great baseline for a behavioral risk survey, included questions about demographics, human-animal contact, unusual illness, human environments, human movement and travel, and socioeconomics. These were themes that the researchers were interested in already. And so this was part of the survey protocol design. These were related to the survey goals. Right? And so then the survey becomes authored based on these major themes, and they actually happen to be the titles of each chapter, let's say, of the survey. This survey was also connected to other data points, like the site characterization form. Just because I can't help talking a tiny bit about survey design, despite having goals and themes that you want to address with your survey, the actual authoring of the survey itself is really important and pretty nuanced. So, and it has relevance to the analysis they're actually able to perform with your survey. So this is just an example of a badly designed question. This is called a double-barreled question, and I think that we get asked questions like this in surveys all the time. The question is, have you already been vaccinated against COVID-19, or do you intend to be vaccinated once you are eligible to receive it? That's fine. A yes, no, unsure, or prefer not to answer, that's fine. But what happens is when you want to analyze this, you'll never be able to say anything about those who are vaccinated against COVID-19. You will always, in your results, always have to be talking about both groups, that people who have been vaccinated and who intend to be vaccinated. You'll never be able to extrapolate anything about those who have yet. So these double-barreled questions artificially pair groups of people together in ways that you won't be able to parse out later in analysis, especially when you make it a multiple choice question. Here's another example of kind of a fine question, I suppose, although I see some double-barreledness in here, but a very strange answer. So this question is, based on all of your recent experiences at IKEA, please rate us on each of the following. IKEA is inspiring and surprising with many home furnishing solutions to try. So that's kind of an okay question, I guess, if you often feel inspired and surprised at the same time. But the odd thing about this is the answers that are provided, right? You know, maybe you're feeling inspired or surprised, but I might always pick this neutral face here because we're talking about IKEA, and you know that's good, right? So it doesn't lend itself to rigorous analysis or understanding your study question any deeper. Gonna skip through some of these. I have endless examples of bad survey questions, so if you like those, I can show you a few more. This is what a collection tool for a survey looks like. On the left is an example of a bubble form, which is a paper sheet, but can also be placed within, you know, a tablet or online tool. There's a lot of digital collection tools available. Open Data Kit is, I think, what the EcoHealth Alliance team uses and recommends. It's free. It also very easily connects with things like R, so that you can analyze your data. And it's a flexible tool, so if you like to code or you like to have a lot of control, you can do that. There's also free, very packaged tools like SurveyMonkey. Qualtrics is, I think, a paid-for survey-specific service. And I will just say with these digital tools, especially the public ones like Google Forms, you have to be really careful about privacy, and that's an ethical consideration that you know, we can talk more about. So, like I said, I think some of the strengths of these methods really shine when you're able to pair them with other data sources. So we have these qualitative methods that give us context. Then we have the quantitative methods, some of which are being collected by you know, people interested in human behavioral risk, but also some who are being collected by other researchers. So we have our questionnaire data that can be paired with all of these qualitative methods, but also the human and animal ecological and biological data, of course, laboratory results, and modeling and analytics. This is a really, another good paper from the Predict group that did a true mixed methods analysis of survey of some qualitative methods and also serology results. So 100 serum samples, or excuse me, let's see, looking at the methods, my notes from the methods of this paper. So I think, you know, something challenging is that there's a really low seropositivity in this sample, but they were able to support some of their findings with the quantitative studies. So low levels of seropositivity in the study could reflect a number of different factors, and they were able to support those factors with their survey and with their qualitative results. So this is a really good example of a mixed methods paper. I'm going to end in 2 slides, and I just couldn't speak about these methods without just talking very briefly about human subjects research ethics. I think this could be a whole slideshow in itself, and it's not something that I can necessarily advise you on broadly. It has to be deeply rooted in what you're actually doing with the human subjects. For example, if you're collecting blood for serology, these ethical rules and protocols will become more stringent based on risk. So I think that, you know, I'm going to give 2 slides on this, but it's extremely important and a topic within itself. So human subjects research is important, and there's a couple sort of consistent elements of ethical human subject research. Informed consent, which means that your participants have to understand what's occurring and agree to be a part of your study. As a human subjects researcher, you always want to minimize risk and maximize the contributions to science and humanity. So as the study becomes riskier, for example, you're taking blood from a human subject, you want to ensure that risk has some sort of reason or merit or application. There's also the Belmont Report, which established 3 important ethical rules for human subjects research, which is justice, beneficence, and respect for persons. These are all actually specific elements of ethical research, and you have to sort of be trained and address each of these elements if you're going to be approved to do such research. All of this has to be voluntary, which I think is pretty straightforward. There's also special protections for vulnerable populations, and that includes pregnant women, prisoners, children, varying literacy levels. So there's part of the ethical consideration is really about your study population and who you're going to be taking, who you're going to be working with, and this also relates back to risk. And then scientific integrity. A sample or human research could be collected, and but if bad science is done to it, it is not ethical research, right? So there's certain qualities within this point, like honesty and rigor. And then there's the IRB, which I think I will go very quickly through because it really is, based on your local IRB board. But this is an independent board that reviews your protocol. And I just want to point out one thing about an IRB, which is that the wording I use in this second paragraph here is an IRB compliant protocol ensures that risks are minimized. So it's not that the IRB board is ensuring that your research is ethical. You have to ensure that your research is ethical, and you present your research to a board and they give you the green light. So it's really up to the researcher themselves to be performing their protocol in an ethical way. Okay, I'm gonna end there, a little over time, so forgive me, but please come and ask questions. Thanks.